learning and to be broadcast on YouTube for those who are excited to be here. Really looking forward to our three panelists who you'll hear a little bit more from today, but I'm personally grateful to have known each of these panelists in a variety of capacities. And I'm just gonna say a word or two about each of them, and then they'll get a chance to share a little bit more as part of the first question that we'll have. But Britta Carlson is a PhD student in practical theology at BU School of Theology. It also comes to us from the ELCA, is that correct? That's the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Yes, I usually just say ELC all the way, but, and Britta does a lot of work around immigration justice, working in communities that are multiply marginalized in that particular issue area, and is connected to a Nuevo Monasterio in Chelsea. I think that's in Chelsea. Revere.
East Boston.
East Boston. Brain on 8 o'clock mode. But thank you so much for being with us today, Britta. Second, I want to introduce Dan Gelbtuch. Dan is my long-term, I think like almost 10 years at this point, Dan. Longtime friend, fellow organizer, fellow justice seeker, and colleague currently as a staff at ECM, is coming to us this morning with that hat and also with his role as part of the Inside Out Wisdom and Action project, which is a project that works with the Jewish social justice leaders to sort of develop spiritual practices and connect them to the wisdom of the Jewish tradition, and then send folks out into the world to do the social justice work. And so we're really grateful to have you here, Dan, offering your wisdom, understanding that this conversation in particular around Christian imperialism, you're not Christian, as you all, as if that wasn't clear. So one, thank you so much for just giving your time and your energy to us today, and helping all of us dismantle this part in all of the empire. So thank you, Dan, for being here with us. Lily Luo, my ace. This is my, I will say, I don't like to say crime because I'm not a criminal personally, but you're my partner in crime. I feel like a lot of my work here at this organization is really built on the foundation that Lily set for me and for all of us. Lily is also a PhD student in political science.
Yeah.
At UConn. And is also on the board of the Mystic Soul Project, which I think you'll use sort of both of those lenses to be in conversation with us. But the Mystic Soul Project is really about centering voices and creating spaces for the centering of voices and practices and all the wisdom of BIPOC folks around kind of spirituality, healing, and activism. So we're really, really excited. Thank you so much for being here today, Lily, and offering yourself in this way. Really excited to have the three of you share from your perspective as we talk about this house that we live in. MCAN set the picture for us, and we're going to start with Imperial Christianity. And I'm going to share my screen very quickly because something that's really important to note with this, this house that we live in, is that there's the foundation, there's these pillars that we were given: white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and Imperial Christianity, right? And they don't just live alone, right? We're having a conversation this morning about Imperial Christianity, but as you'll hear in the questions and what our panelists will offer, the intersections with the other three pillars it's just, yeah, it's real, y'all. And then the other thing that's really important to note, as you've seen in the video and what you see here, is that these things live in, are baked in, sneak in and hide in the way we operate in our world, in our media, in our education system, in our political atmosphere, and especially, as you see in our last one here, in the religious world. And so we don't want to just think about these things as silos or individual arms. One person in our gathering last week, I think it was our panelist, Ellie Dowd, talked about this particular pillar as one face of the many-faced monster that we call empire, right? And so we need to keep all of these in conversation. So with all of that, that's sort of the backdrop. That's what brings us here to this conversation. I'm really excited to learn with and from you three wonderful folks today. And so we're going to just start. I invite folks who are not on panelists, if there are things that come up, if there are questions that are percolating for you, feel free to populate the chat. The panelists were given questions to work with so that we could use our time well. And we believe that the Spirit can move in a variety of ways. So whatever comes up for you, let them know. There's parts of the things that they might say that you'd be like, oh, I really resonate. Go, feel free to use the reactions. You might hear some mm-hms and some amens. Raise your hand if you're like, I'm with you on that. Let our panelists know that you're here with them. And so with that, I'm going to start with the first question. And this is sort of a, what are y'all up to? What is your organization, your community, your parish? What is your commitment to dismantling the house that we live in? And I'm going to ask Lily to start. We'll go over to Britta, and then Daniel close us on this question. So go for it, Lily.
Great, thank you. And what a wonderful introduction. So like Hazel mentioned, I wear a few different hats. One as a scholar and someone who's in academia at the University of Connecticut, and then also as a board member of Mystic Soul. So I would say as a scholar, especially I study and I'm interested in political theory that centers on women of color visionaries and revolutionaries like Grace Lee Boggs, Audre Lorde, and Gloria Anzaldúa. And as a scholar, I think what I'm up to and my commitment to dismantling the house is really providing the ability to imagine a different house, to center and highlight the voices of people who have imagined a different house, who live in a different house, and to kind of remind us all that while this house is strong, it is not the only house. It hasn't been and it isn't today. In that vein, I'm also currently working with Professor Sandy Gran, who's the author of Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought. So that's something else that I've been working a lot on recently, on her project on Indigenous aging and elders. And as a board member of Mystic Soul, which is an organization built on centering the voices, teachings, and dialogue of Black, Indigenous people of color at the intersectionality of spirituality, activism, and healing, I would say, and I shared this with my small group, it was funny, the song, like, what does it mean to make no peace with oppression? And I was like, well, for people in my community, oppression makes no peace for us. So I think actually what it means is centering that healing piece and recognizing that, yes, there's much to be changed about the world, but also the things that are broken, the trauma that we carry is just as much a part of our work in fighting oppression as the external stuff. And so there's a lot of people also from the Mystic Soul community that are working on a support network called TRACK that gives support to frontline activists. And I think just really disrupting the idea that healing something that happens after the protest or after the trauma. But if your trauma is ongoing, then your healing needs to be a fundamental part of your activism. So yeah, I'll just say that for now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. Also, like Hazel said, thanks so much for getting up and being here early. I know it's not easy, and I really appreciate the commitment. So when I think about my community, it's tricky, right? I've recently departed, within the last year, my call at Nuevo Amanecer. And I'm a member of University Lutheran Church in Cambridge, and also the community at the Boston University School of Theology. So my communities are multiple. And I think also a lot about myself as a member of the clergy in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, because so much of the work that I do as a scholar is rooted in my experience as a member of the clergy and as a missionary from within my church. So what I ran into was a kind of paradigm for doing mission that I thought was really great when I first started, which is to, just let's try new things, let's experiment and make space for newness to emerge, and getting a lot of support, kind of verbal support from my denomination. But learning that there are so many structural barriers to actually making that kind of an effort sustainable in the long term because of so Homi Bhabha, who's a post-colonial theorist, talks about being imitators, and within the context of empire, for people who don't fit within the sort of the norms of the empire, to have to try to imitate the culture and the practices of the dominant culture. And so that's actually something that I ran into a lot, was an expectation on the part of the dominant white leadership in the ELCA that the folks in my community would imitate their practices. And I saw this as just entirely unsustainable for a community of primarily poor immigrant people of color. And so a lot of my research focuses on white hegemony in the church and kind of white identity as being conflated with Christian identity. And so right now I'm working a lot on race theory, also a little bit on capitalism. So I know we're going to get to that, but the way that those forces have sort of obscured our understanding of ourselves as Christian people. We understand ourselves, I think, first and foremost as white Americans operating in the church, even when that sometimes is not conscious. It's very much embodied in the way that we behave with one another. So that's the work that I am doing right now.
Great. Should I jump in, Hazel? As Hazel mentioned, I work with Hazel and Natalie and Angel at Episcopal City Mission as the manager of spirituality and sustainability. But for this panel, I will wear my other work project hat, which is the Inside Out Wisdom and Action Project. So Iowa for short, started about 3 years ago and brings two Jewish spiritual lineages, one called Musar and one called the sort of Hasidic tradition or Hasidut, both originating in Eastern Europe in around the 18th century, and brings those practices, sort of translate those practices for Jewish social justice leaders. And the vision there is to provide both resilience, so making this work possible over time, making this work being able to be done from a healthier place, and as Lily mentioned, developing a moral imagination, so how to imagine a better world. And in terms of the house and dismantling the house, I think there's two strong connections. One is just the work itself, so equipping Jewish activists to tackle income inequality or racial injustice, and equipping them with spiritual nourishment and vision to do that over the long term. And then the other, which I'll talk a little bit later about, is supporting Jews to develop a radical identity. A lot of Jews, or white Jews like myself, socialized to be white, and so we're trying to give people access to an identity that challenges whiteness and that is rooted in Jewish radicalism. So I'll talk a little bit later more about that. Thanks.
So as y'all can hear, they're up to some good stuff. We've got the right people with us this morning. And so I'm really excited to learn from you. And this next question really, I think, is, I'm grateful that we're starting at this place, because I think a lot of what you mentioned, Britta, is sort of like this kind of conflation, how things get sort of mixed in and baked in so that we actually don't see the connections in a real way. And that, y'all, is intentional. And so this question of Christian imperialism hiding in our society, living in our midst, often in ways that we can't even see. And so I would love to hear from the three of you. How do you see Christian imperialism living in our society, sort of remembering those, the walls of the house of education and religion and politics, et cetera? how do you see Christian imperialism living in our society? And how, in your experience, how does it get hidden? And as you share from your wisdom, maybe share a few tools that you use to help you identify Christian imperialism in those hidden spaces. And so I'm gonna leave it open and trust that whoever has energy will jump into the conversation, and then we'll just keep going from there.
Yeah, I can kind of pick it up where I left it off. So thinking a lot about Christian imperialism vis-a-vis the Iowa Project, and also related to my own spiritual growth or identity growth, and the ways, as Britta alluded to, in my context, when Jews came to this country in the 1800s, 1900s, and then after the Holocaust, because of trauma, there was a great deal of effort to assimilate into whiteness. And so white Protestant churches became the model for better, I suppose, in some cases, but also for worse in a lot, for the way to be Jewish in America. And so Jews had to sacrifice and leave behind the more radical parts of our identity, including a lot of Jewish spiritual practices. And so Iowa sort of tries to make that, as Hazel said, to show that, to tell that story that I only learned when I started to work for Iowa, but to tell that story and then to give back, really, because these tools have been with us for centuries, give back these spiritual tools and an access to developing a radical Jewish identity in a way that for my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, was often very, very hidden or very marginal and not available. Yeah.
Yeah, Dan, I really appreciate sort of two things I want to lift up. This thing about assimilation into whiteness as a way of survival. For a lot of white communities, sort of I hear this as a narrative for Jewish siblings, for our Irish siblings, and many others, right? And so what does that say about whiteness as the kind of overarching end all that is all in this particular context? So that's sort of one question for us to sit with. And the second, in your work, with Iowa, sort of pointing to going back, right? There's this idea of let's return to the source. We have within our own traditions the very things, in a lot of ways, if we use them well, we have within our traditions the very things that will not only sustain us, but push us back out into the work of justice. And so I really appreciate that you bring that wisdom to this conversation. I want to actually bump it over to Britta, because I know that particular question, sort of in your work, your hat as a practical theologian, like where is the rubber meeting the road in this conversation?
Yeah, it's in so many ways. I was even thinking about, as Dan was talking, in my own, I've done a little bit of work on the history of my own tradition. So that's one tool, history. The history of my own tradition of the Lutheran Church, which, we're talking Germany, Scandinavia. These are very white countries, but even those immigrants faced a great deal of discrimination and had to adapt their practices to look a whole lot more like what Episcopalians and congregational churches were doing, who were far more established among Anglo-Americans at the time. So that kind of ideal of whiteness, I think, understanding that the ideal of whiteness actually transcends people with white skin as a cultural norm, it can be really, really helpful, because I think one of the ways that Christian imperialism is hidden right now, and has been for quite some time, is reflecting on that song that we listened to at the beginning, this idea of making peace with oppression, which is that part of white culture is to be very nice and very polite and very, non-confrontational when it comes to matters of discomfort and conflict. And as a result, we, even though in our heart of hearts we may not agree with the kinds of oppression we see around us, as white Christians, we are hesitant to confront it in forceful ways. which is what is required to dismantle it, is to actually be able to reveal it. So I think that's such an important part as Christians are trying to engage in justice work, is to understand that it doesn't mean we have to be rude or mean, but we do need to be strong. And we do need to be able to speak truth in the midst of oppression. So even just the way that we engage these questions as Christians, to be more radical about it, I think is part of our call. So tools that are useful to me and have been useful to me are looking at our history in this country, and also being able to engage with justice organizations outside of the church and allow them to inform our practices within the church.
Thank you, Britta. I really appreciate this sort of note about the historical context, and not just sort of like just to be history buffs, but is actually to track and trace our experiences and figure out what do we do different in this moment. And I want to note here, because I'm noticing within myself, there's this a conflict of like, who's the we, right? I'm saying we because I'm thinking of like Christian tradition, maybe the Episcopal Church. And we're talking about whiteness, which I 100% agree and understand. And as a Black person operating in a Christian space, the we is not quite the we, like this. So Christianity was given, quote, I'm using some quotes for those who aren't saying given to my people. And I recognize that from a Black church perspective, we have perpetuated some of these Christian imperialism, honestly, because that was what was given to us. So for me, I just want to note the conflict within me about this we. And we, those 25 of us gathered here, are in conversation with one another because we believe that there is some global we that we're trying to work toward, right? And so I just want to note that. And thank you for bringing that to my attention, Britta. I want to shift the direction in this question toward you, Lily, because I see in the work that you do, particularly around Mystic Soul Project, that it's sort of digging deep into the well that we have within ourselves. And by we, in this case, I mean Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? To respond to what we see this face of Christian imperialism and how it gets baked into even our own experiences. And so I just want to offer this space to you to share from your experience how you see it get baked in and what tools you use to begin to dismantle it. So go for it, Lily.
Sure. And I really appreciate what you just said, because I was thinking the same thing. And I think, especially when we're talking about a term that's as big as Christian imperialism, it's really important to be precise about what we mean by that. And for me, I kind of understand it in two distinctive ways. One, like the institution of the church. So for many folks on this call, that might be the Episcopal Church and its legacy with the Anglican Communion. That might be the Catholic Church. It might be the Lutheran Church, but institutions, right? Physical churches and priests and a whole administrative system designed to support that. That's one piece of Christian imperialism for me. The other piece is the cultural dominance that Christian ideology and imagery carries, both in the United States and globally. And just to talk a little bit more about the conflation of Christianity and whiteness in the United States, as Hazel was talking about, Christianity is something that was forced upon people who were enslaved. But at the same time, there's been so much beauty and so much like ownership and taking over of that. And I think that is really the tension. That's something that I think at Mystic Soul, we're also grappling with because, many of our founders and our board members do still identify in some way, shape, or form with the Christian lineage. And yet we're not an explicitly Christian organization. We talk about like spirituality in all of its forms. But yet even a group like us, we find that we can very much fall into Christian hegemony or in normalizing Christianity, if that's our background. I just remember like a story that when I was teaching at Join, which is Jewish Youth and Young Adult Activism Fellowship, labor fellowship. And, I was like, yeah, I'm a Christian person coming into this space and I want to learn from you all. And one of the things that we were talking about was how all of the federal holidays match with the Christian religious calendar, and that's something that I know that we all know, but maybe we don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. And that's kind of like, that's the water that we're swimming in. And it's hard sometimes to notice the water that we're swimming in, especially as folks who might identify as Christians or might identify with those holidays. And I absolutely think that in communities of color, that's not, we're not exempt from that. I think a huge piece that I'm just now really devoting a lot more time and attention to is Indigenous wisdom, because I really think that that is at the heart of what it means to decolonize and what it means to combat Christian imperialism. It's not, it is about identifying the ways in which Christianity has been harmful, but it's also actually giving our time and paying attention to what Christian imperialism has sought to destroy. What was so powerful, what is so powerful, because Indigenous communities and wisdom is continuing to be all around us today. What is so powerful about Indigenous ways of knowing that the institutional church has sought to destroy it? And when I talk about Indigenous wisdom, I'm not just, I think many folks have an idea, okay, like we're the white people and we came and we were settlers and there was like oppression with Indigenous folks in North America and in the Americas in general, and that's absolutely true. But I'm also talking about, I'm doing some research and reading about the witch trials in Europe and the heretic movements in Europe. So in Germany, in France, in England, all the places that we think, oh, white people central. And all of the voices and all of the, especially women that were persecuted because they had a spirituality that the church could not control. And just, so I think what I'm trying to say is that all of this goes so much deeper than just a simple understanding of race and a simple understanding of identity politics. It's about the ways of knowing what is legitimate as spirituality and what are the things that, Christian imperialism has sought to destroy.
Amen. If you felt that, just give that a reaction. All of what you shared, Lily, Mike, I think of my GMO who says, tell the truth and shame the devil. That's some truth telling. So I'm really grateful today. And I think so this conversation, what you all have been sharing has sort of already pushing us to this next question, which for transparency for our panelists, this will be our third and final question. And then the fourth one we'll talk about in small groups. But you've been talking about, we cannot just look at it as a simple, like, oh, this is a simple definition of race, and we need to sort of work with this and map this onto this huge system. Something that came out of last week's conversation, I think it might have been Reverend Eric Littman from Newtonville, who said, the challenge of our time is that we are providing simple answers to complex questions. And I think that's something that's been sticking with me, is like, how do I nuance and complicate my response to such a intertwined and complicated, as he said, complicated system. And something that's been sitting with me for a while that I didn't have words for, honestly, until this summer, is that, so this idea, like the system, whatever that means, right? Sort of this empire knows and understands intersectionality, knows and understands cross collaboration, cross movement work, knows and understands it so much that it works to pit us one against the other. And so for me, the response has to be intersectional. It has to be in conversation, not just Christian imperialism, but as you all have been demonstrating, Christian imperialism conflated with white supremacy, conflated with patriarchy and capitalism, right? And so we really have to continue to pull this thing apart, and that takes a lot of work. And this goes back to sort of the importance of the healing space, of growing the spiritual fortitude and muscles and practices to keep us present in this work. And so I appreciate that y'all have offered that to us and want to sort of continue in that conversation. We've talked a bit, I've heard a bit from you three about so the relationship between Christian imperialism and white supremacy, especially in the Episcopal Church. Thanks, Natalie, for noting the flag that flies in the many churches, the fact that for a lot of people, when they think of the national church, is connected to sort of where the presidents go to have their services as the Episcopal Church. And so we have that as our backdrop. And so there's two other pillars that MCAN has introduced to us in the form of capitalism and patriarchy. And I could talk about that forever, but just want to hear from y'all because no one came to hear me talk. In your work, how do you see Christian imperialism intersecting with the other cornerstones? And maybe in this response, you could focus a little bit more on patriarchy and capitalism. And then after that, we're going to move into some small groups to start to dismantle this together. So offer this as maybe your kind of rapid fire last words in this space. So I'll invite Lily, Dan, and Britta in that order.
That's such a good question. And I think it brings it back to, I just linked in the chat a book that I'm reading for my research right now, Caliban and the Witch. And it's by a Marxist feminist. And she is really interested in why the witch trials happen. You know, was it just mass hysteria? And her theory is that those trials were actually an act of violence against women because those women were powerful and had the knowledge on how to control their own reproductive autonomy and the reproductive autonomy of women around them during the Middle Ages, at a time when peasant communities and heretic communities were actually rebelling against feudal powers en masse. And they were labeled heretics by the church, but they were actually groups of people who attempted to live a different kind of Christian life that was more egalitarian when it came to property, that was more egalitarian when it came to gender relations. And this was also the time that capitalism was being given birth. And those in power knew that if women had control over their own bodies and their reproductive powers, and if peasant communities shared their property and refused the logic of private property, that they wouldn't be able to establish this new form of economic governance called capitalism. And I think that that is just so key to understand the complicity of the church in that, and also the ways in which the church was also invested in capitalism since day one. And that is why all these things were happening. And so when I think about, the history of Christianity, when I was first reading it at first, I was like, my heart is breaking. This is the faith that I'm a part of. My heart is breaking for everything that this faith has done. But then I kind of shifted it too. And I thought, actually, I identify more with the heretics. I identify more with their vision. How come that's not the history of Christianity that I learned? How come that's not the history of Christianity? And so I guess I'll just leave us with this, which is that maybe we need to be the heretics of our times. But that means reckoning with the fact that the heretics were burned at the stake and that they were actively persecuted by the institutional church, and that it will be painful and it will be controversial and it might even be violent, because that is what happens when you stand against power. And are we ready for that?
Britta, are you ready for that? Dan, are you ready for that?
Can't wait. I can't wait.
Lynn, are you ready for that? Malia, are you ready for that? I mean, that's the question. Are you ready? Natalie, actually, I'll say real quick, when we started this Justice Network in June of this past summer, the first question that Natalie pointed us to was, I think was it in June? Yeah, it was in June. So this question, are you willing to lose your life for the sake of in this case, for the sake of my kingdom, for the sake of liberation, for the sake of setting all people free? Are you willing? That is the question that we're up against right now. So thank you so much, Lily, for that. I think you're up, Dan. Did I say you were second?
I'm good.
Go for it.
So, yeah, I think when I think about that, I think a lot about how are we building the Iowa project to embody a different way of being organizationally. And so, whereas capitalism and Christian imperialism create a set of values that are about efficiency, that are about like a lot of people is always the best, where leadership is often white and male. We're trying to figure out how to build this thing in to challenge those paradigms. So to be very relational and very slow in how we're building the organization, and just to be like really aware of the ways that despite our best efforts, because the way that things are, we're still responding to funders in different ways, or desire to grow really quickly, but sort of just building the spiritual muscles to understand that, and then as best as possible to embody something that is different, that is more radical. And in terms of patriarchy, the lineages, the spiritual lineages, for a variety of reasons, were very male dominated, and so we're very intentional in bringing in to sort of the traditional texts of Musar and the Hasidic tradition, texts written by queer people, texts written by Jews of color, texts written by women, texts written by to provide voice for folks that would not have ordinarily been part of the sort of traditional canon.
So I want to talk a little bit about capitalism. Capitalism, the way that I've come to understand it, is that something that capitalism has done is to just really kind of ingrain in us this ideology of individual responsibility, and of making it the responsibility of an individual person to succeed, not only in the economy, which is certainly very much a part of what capitalism actually forces us to do. Catherine Tanner is a theologian who has done a lot of work on capitalism, and she talks about the way that the capitalism actually leaves us with no choice but to make capitalism our God, because we have to participate in it. And by participating in it, we just get deeper and deeper into the system, right? Our investments and our jobs and where we give our allegiance. So that's a huge problem for the church, right? This system has become our God, and we have become subject to it. So that's a big theological challenge. And then in addition to that, you have this more kind of philosophical result of that, is this idea of individual responsibility, both to succeed economically, but also to like get it together emotionally, psychologically. I think about the way that modern psychology is so much a child of capitalism. And that's not to denigrate psychology. I think it's absolutely necessary in the system that we have to provide a space for people to become well enough to survive, right? Psychology allows us to survive in a system that is ultimately dehumanizing and that separates us from each other. So I think that as we and Christianity, unfortunately, has not only contributed to the creation of this system, but has also continued to acquiesce to it over and over again. And if you are looking for evidence of that, look at the way that North American Christians responded to the Latin American liberation theologians, right? Who were using Marxism not as a replacement of Christian theology, which is what they were accused of, but using Marxism because it was a useful tool for them to understand the oppression of the people that they were serving. But the response to that was, we can't use that system. That's of the devil, that's atheist, it's no good to us. And so it's a cycle that continues over and over again. And so I think dismantling capitalism within our theology and within our church systems is very much a part of the work of unmasking empire.
Thank you so much, Britta. And you've gotten Paul off of video and in the chat just going on this. So absolutely. I really appreciate all that y'all have pointed to. Sort of, if you want to understand the relationship between Christian imperialism and capitalism, look at our endowment structures, look at our capitalistic theology, look at our theology of time, right? Capitalism is certainly about money, and it's about how we spend our time, how we understand productivity, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to understand Christian imperialism in a relationship to white supremacy, just look at the church, like just call that. We've had a long conversation about that, right? So there's a lot of wisdom that's been shared here. I do hope that after this, folks will return to this video. It will be shared publicly because I know there's a lot of information. There's a lot to digest there. And there's a lot of resources shared from our panelists in the chat. And so just use your reaction or come off mute and do the hoorays and the thank yous. So much gratitude to the three of you for offering your wisdom in this space, for offering yourself, for offering your time, and beginning to point me in a direction that I think is necessary. And so we're going to actually get a little bit of time to keep digesting, because again, I know it's a lot of information. So I'm going to pass that over to Natalie to help us.
Right. Okay, I'm going to try to be brief so you all get your time talking to one another in the small groups. So again, just reminding us that the idea of this network is to have shared conversation about what it means to do justice, but also to think about building power across the state that can actually, across the Commonwealth, outside of our own parishes, about what it looks like to change and do something different, right? So the idea for these groups is that you'll be going into is to think of them as praxis groups, so both reflection and action. So some space to process the conversation, what stood out to you, what resonated, but then also to think about these specific issue areas that you're in. What would it look like to, to be a church that's moving towards egalitarian practices and these? What would it look like to stand up to some of the ways that we've said it and said life has to be as a church, and to work in the world for change and for justice? So please try to get into both of those spaces, and always though, let the Spirit lead you. So, stay with what you need to stay with. And just as kind of looking forward, in every Justice Network gathering, we're going to have these same pods, right? So if there are people, you can come back each month and be talking with the same group about what could we do? What could we do? What could we do? So it's the beginning of a conversation around action or continuation of a conversation. And you'll have 30 minutes in the small groups. And the facilitator or the panelists will be in some of the groups with y'all. And that's it.
Oh, you want to pause the recording?